Now that you have enzymes set up and you know the basics of snapshot testing, we're going to start exploring how we can snapshot test components that require props. We're going to be focusing on testing the expense list component together. Then I'm going to set you free to test a few on your own. So to kick things off, we're going to create a new components file in the tests components folder. Right here, it is going to be for expense list. So expense list.test.js. Now I'm also going to take a moment to pull up the actual component file, and I will shut down all of the header test related files. Up here, we have expense list. And if you remember, expense list takes in the array, and then it renders a new expense list item for each item in the array. So the goal here is to test this component. When we're testing our React components, we actually want to test the unconnected version because we want to be able to provide a set of dynamic props. So we don't actually want these props to come from the store. Instead, we're just going to provide expenses directly. Now, this can be really confusing at first, but we're going to go through this process together, and by the end, it should be clear. So if we are going to be testing the unconnected version, we actually have to export it. So I'm going to export this as a named export. Now we have two components being exported from this file, right? We have the unconnected version, which we're only going to be using in our test cases, and we have the default connected version, which currently is used inside of the actual application itself. Now what we're going to do is import this guy, and we are going to use some snapshot testing, passing data in to make sure it works as expected. Over here, let's go ahead and kick that process off by importing the things we need. First up, we're going to import React from React since we are going to be using a little bit of JSX inside of here. I'm also going to import Shallow from Enzyme since we are going to be using that to render our component. And we are also going to be importing the component. Now we're importing the named export. Remember, we don't want the connected version. We want the unconnected version so we can dynamically pass in those props and make sure it renders correctly. So right here in curly braces, expense list, and we grab that from the file location. Up 2 folders to get out of the tests directory into the components folder, in there expense list.js. Now the last thing that we're going to grab is the fixtures. We are going to be using that expenses array inside of here, so I can import it. Import expenses from. This time we just have to go up a single directory into the fixtures folder. And in fixtures, we have the expenses file. So these are the imports that we need to actually snapshot test expense list. Now let's go ahead and actually get that done by creating a new test. Should render expense list with expenses. So we're going to see what happens when we render expense list with the given expenses, with those 3 ones that we set up. I'm going to create the arrow function, and now we're going to go ahead and actually render the component with that data. So once again, we are going to create a const called wrapper. We are going to get its value from whatever comes back from calling shallow. And we're going to call shallow with the JSX that we'd like to render. In this case, we're going to render an instance of expense list. This requires an array, so we're going to pass one in. If you remember, this component expects the expenses prop, so we can go ahead and define that right here, expenses. We can set expenses equal to, and what we're going to do is set expenses equal to the expenses test data. EXP-ENSES. Perfect. Now that we have the actual rendered component, what we need to do is set up the snapshot. So I'm going to expect something about the wrapper. I'm going to expect it to match snapshot. Now remember, the first time we run this test case, there is no existing snapshot, so the test can never actually fail. It's going to go through the process of creating the new snapshots file for this one. Let's go ahead and save the expense list test file. The test suite should rerun. We can see one new snapshot was added. And if we actually crack that open, we can see what we get. Right here, we have our test name. It is the first and only snapshot in that test. Then we have the output. We have our H1 and we have our expense list items, and it shows exactly what got passed down for each. So this is the snapshot for the component. And if the component ever changes, we're going to get notified. So let's go ahead and make a change. Let's say, for example, we want to get rid of expense list, which is something that we actually do want to do. If I go ahead and save things now, we're going to get an error. So we see that one of our snapshot tests failed, and we can look through the changes and see if those are changes that we actually meant to make. Did I mean to remove the H1s? Yes. So I can use the U key to update the snapshot, and now we're back to a passing test suite. And if I look over at the snapshot file, we can see the H1, the title, is no longer part of it. Now, this is just one test we could create. We could also create a test case to see what happens when we have no expenses. So when we have that empty array, for example. Currently, the expense list component doesn't support any conditional rendering in that situation, but we could set this up real quick. So let's say I go ahead and add something onto here. I will add the ternary operator. We're going to look at props.expenses.length. If the length is equal to 0, we'll do one thing. If it's not equal to 0, we'll do something else. So right here, this is the value for if it is 0, then colon. This is the value for if it is not 0. If it's not 0, all we're going to do is run this code. We don't need the extra curly braces, so we can remove those. We just need the actual call to props.expenses.map. Now, if it is 0, what are we going to render? We could just render a paragraph tag. So I could render a paragraph tag, no expenses, or something along those lines. Now, if I go ahead and actually save the expense list component, what's going to happen? Well, everything reruns and we can see that our test case is still passing. Why is it still passing? It's still passing because the rendered output is exactly the same. We do have items, so this code doesn't render, this stuff still renders, and it matches the snapshot. But now we could add a snapshot for when there are no items, for when there is an empty array, and make sure that that always works as expected as well. Right here, test should render expense list with empty message. Then I can set up my arrow function and we can add our calls. Now I can just take these two lines and copy them down below. And all we're going to do is change the prop that gets passed in right here. Instead of using the fixture's data, we're just going to use an empty array. And we're going to see what happens when we pass that empty array in. If we save this, we're going to have a new snapshot generated. And if we look at that snapshot, we're going to see the no expenses message is showing up. So now we have a test case to verify that when there are expenses, they show up, and when there are no expenses, we get our error message. If either of those things change, the snapshot tests will fail, alerting us, and we'll be able to respond accordingly. Now that we have a little experience using snapshot testing, it's going to be your turn to do one on your own. So I'm going to close down the snapshot file and the expense list component, though I will leave this one up as a reference. The component that you're going to be testing is expense list item. So expense list item is very similar to expense list. It takes some data in, it renders something. All we want to do is add a snapshot for what it renders. That's going to allow us to track changes to the components over time. So how are you going to get this done? Step 1, you are going to create test file. Then you are going to grab those imports. Then you will create the test case that renders the actual component. So you're going to render expense list item, and you're going to render it with one of the fixture expenses. So you can pick any one of them you like. You could use the first one, the second one, or the third one. Render expense list item with fixture data, and then finally create the snapshot. Now you just need to do this a single time. There is no need for 2 different snapshot tests. You can just add a single snapshot test. And I'd like you to do this on your own. So take as much time as you need. Feel free to refer back to this test file and the header test file. You can use any of the code we wrote inside of either of those files to get the challenge done. So pause the video, knock this out, and test your work. Look at the output snapshot file and make sure it looks correct. When you are all done, you can go ahead and click play. All right, how'd that one go? Hopefully you were able to get that done without too much trouble. I know there was quite a bit to do. Let's go ahead and kick the process off. Step 1, creating a new file in the tests components folder. This one is going to be for expense list item. So expense list item.test.js. And inside of here, we're going to go ahead and actually set up the imports first. So we need to import React from React. I'm also going to import the shallow renderer from Enzyme. I'm also going to import the fixtures data since I do need them. So I will import expenses from up a directory inside of fixtures. And in there we have expenses. And finally, I need to import the component we're trying to actually test. So I'm going to import expense list item, and I'm going to grab that from the following file. Now, expense list item has just one export, and it is the default one. Since there is no connected version, there's no need to export the unconnected version because we already are. So we can grab the default here, and we are going to grab that from, go up to folders, go into the components folder, and grab that thing. Expense list item. Perfect. Now that we have everything imported, we can actually go through the process of creating the test case. Test. And I can set up the test name should render expense list item correctly. And I'll set up the arrow function. And now what we need to do is actually render the component and make an assertion about it using the snapshot functionality. So const wrapper equals, we are going to call shallow, and we're going to render our component. Now I'm going to go ahead and render a single instance of expense list item. Now what you needed to do was get some data inside of it. And if you remember, it expects a few props, ID, description, amount, and created at. You could have passed these down any way you wanted. Maybe you added each one on. You could have gone ahead though and spread out one of the expenses. So I can spread out the object available on expenses, and I'm going to grab the first one. So this gets the object, and this spreads it out, adding all of its properties as props to expense list item. Now we can go ahead and actually create the snapshot. I can use expect to expect something about the wrapper to match snapshot. The very first time we run this file, it's always going to pass. There is no chance there is an existing snapshot that doesn't match. But if we do look at the snapshot for expense list item, we can see it looks pretty good. We have the ID inside of the link to attribute. We have gum, which is the title in the H3, and we have the amount and the created at value in the paragraph down below. Now, if we ever make any changes to the component, we're going to be alerted because we do have a snapshot tracking it. So that was all you needed to do for the challenge. I'm going to go ahead and remove the challenge comments and save the file. There are two more components I do want to write snapshot tests for before we go. Those two components are, first up, the expense dashboard page. This is a very simple component that does almost nothing. And we also have the not found page. So we are going to be adding snapshots for both of these, and that's going to be very, very similar to how we added snapshots for the header component. It's a very simple setup. We just render the component with no props, and we make a snapshot assertion about it. So I'd like you to once again go through that process for both of those components, expense dashboard page and not found page. Add a test file for each, create the test case for each, and create a snapshot for each. Then go into the snapshots folder and make sure that both snapshots are looking good. Take some time to knock that one out. You can pause the video. Once again, make sure to test your work. Then you can come back and click play. All right, you should have been able to get that one done with no trouble since you did just go through a more complex challenge. I'm going to go through that process first up for not found page. So what am I going to do? I'm going to add a new file to the tests components folder, not found page.test.js. Then I'm going to go ahead and add everything inside. Now the process is going to be so similar to header, we could even start with that file as a template. I can copy it. I can paste it over here, and we can just make a few changes to it. Not found page has a default export, so we can change that here. Not found page. And over here, the file name, not found page. Down below, should render not found page correctly, and then we just pass it in. Not found page. No rocket science here. If we now go ahead and save the file, we are going to have that new snapshot generated. And if we take a quick peek at that snapshot, we can see that off the bat, it looks pretty good. So now we have changes tracked for that component as well. And to wrap this video up, the last really easy component to test is the expense dashboard page. So I am going to go ahead and add a file for that right here. Expense dashboard page.test.js. Then we're going to go through that process once again. We can just paste the header test file and make those same changes. I'm going to change it here. Then I'm going to take this and copy it right here, and finally right here. And there we go. Now we should have one more additional snapshot. And if we look at that snapshot, it does look correct. So now we've knocked out all of the easy wins. A lot of our components don't do a whole lot, which makes them great candidates for just a single snapshot test. But we do have other components that have a lot more complexity. So we're going to start diving into those because they're going to require us to learn how we can manipulate the user interface, clicking buttons, changing input values, all sorts of interesting stuff. So now that we've explored the very basics of testing React components with Enzyme and snapshots, let's go ahead and dive into some more complex testing. I'm very excited to get to all of that, so stay tuned and I will see you in the next one.